Oh, hello. Welcome to our first episode. I'm Isabelle Rogol, and this is Borderline, a podcast for those who leave home to get home. If you know me at all, you know I've been a podcast fiend for years. I was listening to them even long before we had iPhones, and that's my one claim to coolness, if by cool you mean super nerdy. I'm therefore way overdue in starting my own. And if you know me at all, you'll understand why the theme of this podcast is a bit of a no-brainer. If you don't know me, allow me to introduce myself. I'm a journalist and a bit of a global citizen. I am French, but I was educated in the US, as you may be able to hear. I also lived in Cambodia and in Australia, and I am now a resident of London. That makes my accent a total mess, which you will be able to hear occasionally in this podcast. I apologize in advance. This podcast is really for global citizens. We're not very popular right now, at least among a subsection of world leaders and of the electorate. But I think it's really about a life that values openness and diversity and discovery, and that is worth celebrating and defending. And so we're going to explore so many different topics, from travel to immigration, the philosophical as to what it means to be a global citizen, what globalization maybe got wrong, the reasons behind the backlash. We're going to also talk about the practical of immigration, of schooling around the world, of building social circles in countries after countries. And I intend really to keep this broad and bring a lot of different topics under this umbrella, so neither you nor I get bored at any point. And this is my life. I have ideas easily for like 4 seasons of this, but my experience is just a subsection of what it means to be a global citizen. And so I'm really keen to hear from all of you. This is a community. One way you can do that is to go to borderlinepod.com and you can leave a voicemail, which I can later air on the podcast. I hope to have messages from all of you on every single episode. You'll find me on all the usual social media sites. LinkedIn is really my preferred platform because that's where my people are, and it's way less crazy than everywhere else. Now, let's get started with today's conversation.
I'm certainly not planning to eat or drink anything, and I'm actually hoping to not use the lavatory as well. And with the mask on the whole time, my goal would be to get a seat in the very last row, window seat. Hope for nobody next to me. I won't interact with anyone. I'm hoping to really have a little bit of personal space and keep to myself.
Is that what it takes to travel safely and confidently in the post-COVID world? And if so, should we even bother to resume traveling? What does this mean for an entire industry and a way of life? Today's guest is Zach Honig, editor-at-large at The Points Guy. Zach is a college buddy of mine. He's also a New Yorker, but whenever I'm in the city, he's not there. That's because Zach actually flew 225,000 miles away from home last year, and that wasn't even his best year. That's 10 times around the planet, around the equator. Zach is part of a community that is fascinating and a bit of a mystery to me. That's the Travel Miles community, who are so good at optimizing the way they travel and preferably for free. Zach is a frequent traveler and a travel journalist, and I've asked him to come on to talk about the very weird new way to travel. You'll also hear voicemails from a couple Borderline listeners about their own experience of travel during the pandemic. Zach, I think you've probably spent more time at home in 2020 than in like all of the past decade combined. When was the last time that you were on a plane?
Oh my goodness. Well, actually, I did end up traveling a bit just before lockdown. So I ended up booking a last minute weekend trip to Aruba, and that was in the beginning of March. And so actually, I think that was end of February. And I kind of anticipated, not being able to travel all that much over the months to follow. And so my girlfriend and I went to Aruba for I think it was a 1 night trip. We actually only spent 1 night there. Um, and she wasn't able to get off work on Friday, so we went Saturday morning and came back Sunday night. But it was a great trip. And then I had another 1 night trip to Los Angeles for work at the beginning of March. But I had so many trips on the books that I ended up having to cancel. I can't even remember them all at this point, but definitely some plans have been changed.
When do you think that you'll start traveling again?
So I don't know when this is going to air, but I am actually planning. So it may have happened or it may not have happened by that point, but I'm planning to go to Iceland and be one of the first arrivals. So June 15th currently, and I'm still waiting some official confirmation. But Iceland is supposedly going to allow international visitors and potentially even from the United States. And so there'll be three options. You can either arrive with a negative COVID test that was taken within the last 48 hours. You can take a test upon arrival, and you'll get those results within 5 hours, or you can quarantine for 14 days if you choose to do that. And so I'm still waiting confirmation on which flights will actually operate. Iceland Air is selling flights from Newark, but the guidance I've gotten is that they may not actually fly. And so it's all up in the air, so to speak, but it could be within less than 2 weeks.
What do you expect it to be like? I mean, are you concerned about flying, about, are things even going to be open?
Yeah. So what's really appealing about Iceland is they managed to really eliminate COVID on the ground there. There aren't any active cases, and they cut off the borders pretty quickly. I think by the end of March, you weren't really able to enter without a mandatory quarantine, and so there have been some flights operating. I think right now there's only up to 6 flights a week in total, 6 round trips. And then a lot of the sites were closed. But for what I've read, actually, many restaurants stayed open. Hairdressers and other kind of close encounter type services were closed, and a lot of the tourist attractions, they just didn't have any business. But for the most part, they've really been able to get the pandemic in check there. And so, what I'm expecting is that once I arrive, once I, am able to get a negative result, and I actually just had a COVID test in New York a few days ago, so that was negative as well. But once I get that negative result, I'll be able to kind of enter society freely there, it seems, and even dine in restaurants and go to pubs and it sounds like people there aren't even wearing masks, and there isn't really any need. I'm sure that some tourists will kind of slip through here and there, especially those that claim that they're going to go into quarantine. But hopefully with, active contact tracing and everything, they'll be able to get those cases under control very quickly on an ongoing basis. So as far as the flight, it's my biggest concern. But my father's a physician in Philly, and he's been seeing COVID patients almost every day. And he's been getting very, very close to people. He wears an N95 mask and a surgical mask on top of that, and then a visor on top of that as well. And he's always, he's had his hand washing protocols down for, since he became a physician. And so talking to him, as long as I kind of take that same approach to the flight, I'm certainly not planning to eat or drink anything. And I'm actually hoping to not use the lavatory as well. And my goal would be to get a seat in the very last row, a window seat, hope for nobody next to me. And then, I do have an N95 mask that I got in January, actually. And so I have a few of those. And so I actually did try to donate them, but they're the industrial version of the N95. So there's 2 versions. And the industrial version has this valve on the front. And so when you exhale, anything goes right out through the valve. And so it can't really be used in a hospital setting. but that's where I've actually attached pantyhose to the front of it. I've sewn them on to cover the valve and to protect other people, and then I'll wear a surgical mask on top of that. But I won't eat or drink. I won't interact with anyone. I'm hoping to really have a little bit of personal space and keep to myself. And with the mask on the whole time, my father's confident that I should be a-okay.
That's quite a picture you're painting. If that's if that's what it takes to travel
I
internationally
know.
for the foreseeable future, do you expect travel to come back to the levels that we've known?
It's a lot of steps. I mean, I'm even thinking about things like, going through the TSA checkpoint. I'm planning to bring trash bags to separate all my belongings ahead of time, put them in the trash bags so that there's no chance of any kind of secondary screening. Use the trash bags for the way back as well, just to kind of protect all my belongings. I may even do that on board the plane too. Is just put my bag in a trash bag there. I'm going to drive myself to the airport, park myself. Things I would never have considered before. Paying for daily parking within walking distance of the airport is something I'm fairly frugal. I would call myself a frugal luxury traveler if is such a thing. And I'm definitely kind of changing the approach, and I think that in order to stay safe, a lot of people may want to consider that. And so, as long as I'm able to kind of stay away from everyone, the big question is the bathrooms and the lavatory, I think. But I'm hoping for the best. I know that that's really not any way to go about it. It's a leisure trip. And I'm even going by myself so that there isn't really anyone else to worry about. I'm generally not a solo traveler either. I'm looking forward to it, but it's definitely going to be a different experience. I think that those of us that are used to really enjoying the journey, in some cases as much as the destination, are really going to have to kind of keep an open mind and be willing to compromise a lot. Airlines have really cut back on the in-flight service. And even so, even if there was a full service offered, I wouldn't be comfortable eating or drinking anything on the plane. So I'm taking a very cautious approach. I think that, everyone's going to handle it differently. And just because this is the way I'm doing it doesn't mean that it's the right way, but it's the way that I feel comfortable and my family feels comfortable, kind of having me return directly to our group here in quarantine. And so we've talked it through, and we're confident that this is a safe way to do it. Have you thought about traveling yourself?
Well, I have actually recently, because I was in lockdown with my parents in France for many reasons, including that when the lockdown started in France, it looked like the British government was not going to take this seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became a situation where, I kind of had to make up my mind because we had no idea whether the borders were going to stay open. And so my father drove from France, got on the ferry, drove to London, picked me up, and we drove back because of, if I got on the train at the time when there were very little restrictions, it was not going to be safe for me to then be in the same house with my parents.
Right.
So I isolated for a couple weeks before returning home, and then I made the trip as isolated as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And this was on the first day of the French lockdown, so there were actually very strict rules on the ferry. Everyone had to stick to their cabins. They were not allowed to walk around. There was an order, each deck on the ferry, you were allowed to get out of your car only when told to do so, get to your cabin, lock yourself in, and don't go out again until you get to your destination. And I, similar to what you were just saying, I wiped every surface before I let my father touch anything, and I was pretty paranoid about it.
Yeah.
This was mid-March, when I think we were all just very scared. But I took the Eurostar a couple weeks ago, returning to London after 2 months in France, once France opened up and we were allowed to do that. And it operates under French law, which mandates masks in public transport, which forces companies to only sell every other seat. And even then, not every seat was sold. So it actually felt extremely safe on the Eurostar. And I can't speak for every transportation company, but I think they're kind of ahead of the curve in terms of adapting. And it just felt a lot safer than my local supermarket.
Yeah, I mean, here in the U.S., a number of airlines have started by blocking the middle seats, which, I mean, sure, you're still not really able to. There's no way that you can keep 6 feet of distance on a full flight, even with all the middle seats blocked. But I can't picture being that passenger sitting in the middle seat right now, so close to two other people, plus the people in front and behind. I think that at the very least, I would feel very anxious being in that situation. And I think for peace of mind, that gesture goes a long way. We've seen some airlines kind of implying that they're blocking seats, but not actually doing it. And then you may have encountered some of those photos on Twitter of planes that ended up going out completely full. United, for example, had been kind of promoting through social media and even emails directly to customers that they were blocking the middle seats. But what they were doing was they were blocking the seats for pre-selection. But if all of the seats were sold, then they would be assigned at the gate. And so passengers expected to have that extra space and didn't actually get it. And so I think that some airlines are really building trust with customers right now, and others are really going a long way to erode that. And so I think that we're going to see some shifted loyalties, over the next few months and years even. I don't know if you know anyone that's struggled to get a refund. That's been such an issue here in the States. People that had planned to travel and had flights canceled or hotels canceled, and actually have the airlines and hotels holding on to their money. I actually encountered that in Germany. The hotel I booked there was fully refundable up until a day before arrival, but they still wouldn't process a refund for me. They were holding on to my refundable deposit. And so I actually had to go through the process of filing a chargeback with American Express. And actually just this morning, I got an email that the reversal is permanent and that I finally have that money back. But it was crazy just to see, these policies that was a fully refundable stay and they still want to give me a refund. And so I think that, people are going to be really hesitant to book with some of the travel providers that really misbehaved during this pandemic. And I understand the financial situation, but, especially for fully refundable bookings, to kind of hold on to that money like that, when a lot of people are really have a financial need, just not the way to handle it. I know that, a lot of these travel providers are in such a bad position, and I emphasize with that, but still, it just I I can't imagine booking with some in the future. It's going to take a while to really overcome, some of the damage that's been done, I think.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system.
Last March, my wife and I packed most everything we could fit into our Subaru Outback, including our baby and our dog. And we left our home in Brooklyn, New York, and took a very long road trip to Tupelo, Mississippi. Now, Brooklyn and Tupelo, on the one hand, really couldn't be more different places, but they each had something in common for us. They're each places that my wife and I call home. She grew up in Tupelo, and we have a small house here. We come because we want to spend time with the people we love. But we live in Brooklyn. It's just that in Brooklyn last March, things were confusing. COVID was getting worse by the day. We were nervous for our own health, nervous for the people around us, and suddenly we were tasked with working from home without childcare. We needed to take care of our child. So we didn't think a lot about this road trip. We literally just got in the car and went. And it was a weird thing to travel last March when not just Brooklyn was shut down on quarantine, but so was every place else. And there was this feeling of receding, this skepticism. I remember we felt nervous about having New York license plates because things were so bad in New York and they weren't at other places yet. We couldn't really stop at restaurants because most of them were closed. We couldn't really stop to go to the bathroom at public parks because even the bathrooms there would be locked. I have now peed in a regional park outside of Washington, D.C., and the backyard of a Baptist church in Hollywood, Alabama. But it was a remarkably short trip because the thing is, nobody else was on the road. And the trip ended in a really good spot. The trip ended with friends and family. And while we quarantined for 2 weeks, afterward, we've had the joy of getting to live with them.
We've seen a few airlines even go into administration, whether that's Flybe or Virgin Australia or Bianca. What's the airline landscape going to look like in 2021, 2022? Are we even going to fly nearly
I
as
think
much?
it's really hard to say at this point. I know that, here in the US, a lot of people have felt more comfortable traveling or really have a need to, either college students were still stuck at campus. Even though classes were canceled, a lot of them stayed where they were and sheltered in their dorm rooms and attended class online from their dorms. And so we saw a big uptick in travel over the last few weeks as all of these college students kind of finally made their way home. And then we're seeing some leisure trips as well. It's really interesting to see the United States is really handling this so differently depending on where in the country you are. So it's handled on the state level. And so each state and sometimes individual cities or counties are making the rules as to, whether or not businesses can open and, when people need to, be sheltering in place. And that's been the case since the beginning. And so we're seeing, especially in some of the southern and Midwest states, they've essentially completely reopened at this point. And in many cases are effectively behaving like, coronavirus is not an issue at all. But as far as what it's going to look like and the whole landscape, I think it really depends on when people start traveling again at close to the levels that they were before the pandemic. And so, in the US, there's been an uptick and flights are full, but there's the number of flights that are operating is just a tiny fraction of what had been flying before. And so we're seeing small flights and flight loads in the 70 to 80% in some cases, but and those airlines are flying maybe 2, 3, 4, 5% of the flights that they had originally planned to fly. And so we're seeing high loads, but low numbers of passengers overall. And that'll probably continue for some time. And then, that's not even really factoring in the, potential hits to the economy. And people right now, remain in a financial position to travel, but that may change over time as well. And so it really just depends on where everything is headed. I think it's too early to say, even if we're going to be, I don't know when travel is going to pick up, to be completely honest. I know airlines were originally planning for summer of 2021. I've heard estimates that, it could be at least a year beyond that before we're anywhere close to the levels we were at before. But I don't think anyone really knows. And, I'm actually been looking at traveling more within the US. And so it's something that I've always wanted to do. We actually booked a house in Maine for the entire month of August. And so I was able to get a good deal because Maine, because it's all really handled on the state level here, Maine has put in place a requirement to quarantine for 14 days. So any visitors that come to Maine, will need to essentially shelter in place. It's a little bit more flexible. You can kind of walk around, outside as long as you're staying away from other people. But a lot of people would travel up to Maine from Boston, even from New York, for a long weekend. And that's just not going to be possible this season. And so, as a result, there's a lot of inventory on Airbnb. And if you do have the means and ability to travel somewhere and work remotely for a month, it's a good option.
That's definitely the vibe here in Europe. This sort of return to localism. Sometimes shrouded in a bit of patriotism, anti-globalist sentiment, but it's like, why do you even bother going to other countries? Like, let's all stay home. And it's fair, and there's plenty. I mean, when you live in Europe, even without going to another European country, there's plenty to see at
Yeah.
home. And that's kind of the message. I know that's the message that the French government is giving right now. Summer holidays are kind of sacred in France. That's where a lot of money is made in the tourism industry. And obviously there's also that sense of like, well, if you want to support your country, do stay and travel locally, because we're not getting foreign tourists and our tourism industry is collapsing. And so there's a bit of, put your money in your
absolutely.
own community.
So I mean, it's kind of, it's a new type of kind of feel good tourism in a way too. I mean, you feel like you're helping people out. I mean, that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. I'm hopeful that, we'll be able to resume normal life without coronavirus at some point soon, but it's just, I mean, I'm not especially optimistic, I guess.
At the tone, please record your message.
My name is Clara, and I'm from Argentina, but I live and work in the UK. And my travel experience in the COVID-19 world involved a transatlantic flight to visit my family back in mid-March, where everything was very different from now, and policies were changing constantly. So I spent the whole 13 hours of flight worried that the borders in Argentina would close. I didn't know what would happen. Those were the rumors back then. And also what was meant to be a 10-day trip ended up being a 3-month trip. And in terms of returning to the UK, basically my return involved lots of communications with embassies and consulates and special flights and special lists of people wanting to return home, which is definitely not the usual peaceful, straightforward travel experience. So I'm looking forward to go back.
So I have one last question for you, because I know you have to run. I'm wondering if, this whole experience of spending the last 3 months at home and has made you kind of rethink your traveling habits and how much of your life you've spent on the road. And there's been a lot of conversation of, should we even want the before world back? So do you want your before world back?
I think that in some ways I do. I had actually already made a change. So when I first started this job at the Points Guy, so it's been 5 years now, and when I first started, I was flying just to fly in many cases. Flight reviews are kind of core to what we do. And in order to really capture that content, you have to travel and you have to do as many flights as you can to be, efficient on a trip. And so I would schedule these around the world trips where, in some cases it was kind of back to back. I would go all the way around the world in about a week. And so, half that time would be spent sleeping on planes. And then maybe, I'd get 3 nights of that week in hotels at some destination. So that just, I knew that wasn't sustainable, but, I felt like I was young enough and, I wasn't really leaving anything behind, and I was getting to experience something. At one point, a couple of years ago, something kind of clicked, and I just really changed my approach. And before I kind of booked a trip, I would plan out a few days at the destination. So, and I tried to avoid giving up my weekends. I like to spend my weekends at home if I could, with my family and friends. But, if it meant spending a weekend somewhere else, I would do that. And I would try and visit somewhere new. Changing that kind of approach really enabled me to experience things differently and made the trip much more fulfilling, I would say. And so I'd love to return to that, maybe with a little bit more of a balance at home. And spending more time with family. I know that once this is over, I don't think I'll ever have a period where I'm back here for months at a time, but it's been really nice. And, I know that a lot of people are really, really suffering and struggling right now. And I don't want to discount that at all. And, I'm thinking about them a lot. my dad and his stepmom are both working with patients that are, in situations that are far from ideal. And, I'm seeing a lot of people try and look for the upside of this pandemic experience. And for a lot of people, there just isn't one. And I think that we need to consider that a lot as well. And I am, and, I'm taking this opportunity to make donations where I can and to help get the word out, in other ways. And ultimately, I feel the way that I can be most impactful right now is to really, keep watch of my brother and sister so that my dad and stepmom can reach as many patients as they possibly can. As far as the future, I mean, I do hope that we're able to travel in the way that we could before. I think that, there's a lot of people that do it in a way that is fulfilling, and others, not so much. But for people that were really enjoying what they were doing before and feeling fulfilled and connecting with other cultures, I hope that's able to return.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Zach. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me. It's so nice to reconnect with you too. And I hope that you're able to reconnect with more friends through this podcast.
Definitely. That's the plan.
I can't wait to listen.
And new friends. Thanks. Well, stay safe in Iceland. I look forward to seeing all the Instagram stories on that
Yeah,
trip.
thanks. I hope it happens. We'll see.
Sorry, Zach. It didn't happen. Shortly after our interview, Iceland decided that it would only let in travelers from the Schengen area of Europe, and therefore Zach, as an American, is not quite welcome yet there, hopefully later this year. I want to thank Zach again for being a guinea pig and agreeing to being the first guest on Borderline. I also want to thank Clara Aguirre Hernando and Jesse Hempel for their voicemails. Jessie, as you probably could tell from her wonderful narration, also is a podcast host. It's called Hello Monday. It's on all the platforms, and I strongly recommend you subscribe. It's my weekly dose of inspiration. Next week, we'll talk about international students, the global competition among universities for international students, and their own situation during the pandemic when they've had to go home, perhaps, or stay abroad in the middle of a pandemic. If that's your situation, if you're a prospective student who's worried about what's going on next year, please share your story. Reach out, again, borderlinepod.com to leave a voicemail, or you can reach out on LinkedIn or other social media. I really want to hear your stories. I also want to say a word to the events that are happening around the world. This incredibly important fight for racial justice and equality. I've lived in the US, and we've seen this before, unfortunately, this unspeakable pain, these protests. I think there's something unique now, though, in that it's traveling around the world, and this event that started in a very specific American context is being translated around the globe into local fights in different cultures and different historical contexts. I think that's really unique, really important, and fascinating, and so I'll definitely be addressing that on the podcast soon. If you have opinions on that, thoughts, guest suggestions, please again reach out at borderlinepod.com. Thank you so much. The huge power that you have right now to spread the word about this podcast, I cannot understate. There are like 3 of you listening, so each of you really, really holds the key. Please share on your social media. Leave a review on Apple. That's super important. Rate the podcast. Spread the word if you think this is a good idea and you want to listen some more. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you next week.